The silver tray did not fall. That was the part nobody ever talked about afterward. Not the laughter coming through the half-open door. Not the warmth of jasmine tea curling upward into cold corridor air while the world as Seraphina Wolfhart had known it quietly cracked down the middle. The tray stayed perfectly, terrifyingly still in her hands. Because Seraphina did not tremble. Understand that first, before anything else about the story reaches you. Because what follows will tempt you to wait for the moment she finally breaks apart. It will tempt you to watch for tears, for screaming, for some dramatic collapse that would make the betrayal feel proportionate. That moment never comes. Seraphina Wolfhart, Luna of Nightbane Keep, had spent 6 years learning to carry weight without letting anyone see the effort. She had stood beside Alpha King Dorian Grimshade through 3 border rebellions, 2 winters of famine, and 1 plague that swept through the eastern settlements like something ancient and hungry. She had negotiated trade routes that kept warriors fed. She had sat beside dying soldiers and held their hands when their own families were too frightened to enter the sickness tents. She had been the quiet architecture holding the entire kingdom upright. And the kingdom had never once looked down to notice the foundation. Tonight she was carrying Dorian's evening tea through the obsidian corridors of Nightbane Keep. Wolfsbane leaf, jasmine, 2 drops of mountain honey pressed from northern bees. She knew his preferences the way she knew the sound of his breathing in sleep, without thinking, without effort, from pure repetition. The corridors were dark except for the iron torches burning low against the walls. She noticed one guttering in the far bracket. She would ask Aldrich, the head steward, to replace it before morning council. She noticed the young maid named Petra limping near the east stairwell and made a note to check whether the girl's ankle had worsened since yesterday. She noticed the cold draft pushing through the crack beneath the north-facing window and remembered the wool she had ordered from the Thornfield weavers had not yet arrived. She noticed everything. That was who Seraphina was. The woman who saw every uneven flame, every limping servant, every gap where cold could enter. And then she rounded the corridor toward the royal chambers, and she heard it. Laughter. Soft. Feminine. Familiar in a way that reached through her chest and closed around something. Talia Raven Moon. Then Dorian's voice followed. Low. Comfortable. The voice he used when the performance of kingship fell away and only the man beneath remained. She'll forgive me. She always does. No hesitation. No guilt. No lowered voice, as though the words were something shameful. Just certainty. Just the ease of a man who had never once had to worry about whether his forgiveness would come, because it had always arrived before he finished asking. Seraphina stood completely still in the corridor. The mate bond pulsed beneath the Luna mark at her collarbone, warm and involuntary and heartbreakingly unaware of what it had just heard. She did not move for 7 full breaths. She counted them, not because she was trying to stay calm, but because some part of her mind had simply stepped back from the moment and started watching from somewhere very far away and very cold. 6 years. 6 years of waking before the sun to prepare reports no one realized she had organized. 6 years of remembering every name, every wound, every unspoken need throughout the entire kingdom. 6 years of loving a man so completely that she had stopped noticing where her edges ended and his began. And he said her forgiveness like it was something he kept in a pocket, something he reached for without looking, something that had always been there and therefore required no gratitude, no care, no thought of what it cost to give it. Seraphina inhaled once. Then she turned around. She walked back through the corridor quietly, passing the guttering torch and the limping maid and the cold draft through the cracked window. She set the tray down on a side table near the servants' passage. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. And then she went to their chambers, her chambers really, the ones she had made warm with cedar oil and winterbloom arrangements and carefully chosen candlelight, and she sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 1 minute. She did not cry. She opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and she began very slowly to pack. She removed the Nightbane Luna crest from her throat last. It was silver and shaped like a crescent moon enclosed by a wolf's howl, and she had worn it every single day for 6 years. She set it on the stone table beside a single piece of folded paper. On the paper she had written only this: You loved my loyalty more than you ever loved me. By the time the first pale light touched the eastern mountains, Nightbane Keep stood behind her like something that had already forgotten she was ever there. Snow was falling. She did not look back. Not because she stopped loving him, because she finally understood he had stopped seeing her. Hi viewers. Before we go any further into Seraphina's story, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest in the comments below. Have you ever given someone your absolute best, your time, your loyalty, your quiet sacrifice, and they only noticed its value the moment you stopped giving it? Drop a yes or a no down in the comments right now. And if you have a story, even just one line of it, I want to read it. You might be more Seraphina than you realize. And if this kind of story, the kind that does not scream, but still shakes you, is what you come here for, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. New stories go up every week, and trust me, you do not want to be the last to know. Now, let us get back to Seraphina, because this is where it gets real. Chapter 1. The Woman Inside the Kingdom. To understand what Nightbane Keep lost the morning Seraphina Wolfhart walked out of its eastern gate, you have to understand what it had while she was still inside it. Not her title, not her beauty, not the ceremonial silver crest she wore at her throat. Her mind. Seraphina had been born with the particular gift of people who see systems, the invisible scaffolding beneath every functioning thing. She saw supply routes the way a river sees its own bed. She saw diplomatic tensions before they became confrontations, the way a healer sees infection before it becomes fever. She saw human needs, specific, individual, quietly urgent, in the people around her, and she moved toward it without being asked, because waiting to be asked had never made sense to her. She had been doing this inside Nightbane for 6 years. At the 4th hour before sunrise, while Dorian Grimshade slept in the royal chambers above her, Seraphina was already in the small administrative room she had quietly claimed for herself. Tucked beside the library, smelling permanently of old paper and cedar smoke, unknown to most of the council. The eastern supply caravans from Thornfield were due before noon, and the routing ledgers had not been touched since Osric, the previous steward, had died of river fever in autumn. 3 settlements in the Northern Territories were at risk of half rations through the coldest months if someone cross-referenced the wagon tallies against the storage reports before the midday council meeting. Nobody else knew the problem existed. Seraphina solved it before breakfast. By the time the council gathered, the corrected routing orders were already dispatched. 3 settlements would eat through winter. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody knew to mention it. That was simply how it worked. She moved through the keep each day the way a river moves through its landscape. Quietly, constantly, shaping everything it touches without ceremony. She knew the warrior Brennan's wound was not healing cleanly and had quietly rerouted his care to the head healer with specific instructions. She knew the new stable boy, Pip, 11, recently orphaned from a collapsed farmhold in the south, was sleeping cold because no one had assigned him proper winter quarters, and she had arranged for that to change before he caught sickness. She knew that the 2-year negotiation between Clan Ashvale and Clan Dawnmere, which Dorian believed was simply progressing on its own, was progressing because she had spent 2 weeks in careful correspondence with both clan elders, learning exactly which grievances mattered most to each side, drafting letters that made each elder feel genuinely heard rather than managed. She had filed every letter under Dorian's name. He had signed them without reading them closely. She had watched him do it across the council table, the practice scan, the confident pen stroke, the easy setting down of the quill. He trusted her. She had never doubted that. He simply did not see her. And there had been a time, a gentler time, when that distinction had not felt like something that would eventually break her. She remembered the early years. Dorian had not always been blind to her. In the beginning he had seen her with a clarity that made her feel, for the first time in her life, entirely known. He had ridden 4 hours through muddy post-battle roads to bring her moon lilies after the siege at Velthorn Pass, armfuls of white and silver blooms that only flowered through frost, because she had mentioned once, in passing, that they were her favorite thing about winter. He had traced the Luna mark on her shoulder on quiet evenings by the fire, and told her she was the only stillness in his world that did not feel like captivity. She had loved him with everything she had. She had given him that love freely, completely, and without accounting for what she might need in return, because love, when it is genuine and deep, does not come with ledgers. It simply gives. But love cannot survive indefinitely on one person's generosity. Dorian had not turned away from Seraphina with a single hard decision. He had simply gotten comfortable. Comfortable with her competence, comfortable with her reliability, comfortable with the certainty that she would handle whatever needed handling, which freed him to stop handling the work of truly knowing her. She had become reliable, and reliability, to a man who associated strength with conquest, had quietly begun to feel like a given rather than something precious. Then Talia Ravenmoon arrived. She had come 3 months prior under the formal cover of a diplomatic visit from Clan Ravenmoon in the Southern Territories. She was striking in the way that demanded rooms rearranged themselves around her. Loud in her presence without ever raising her voice. She laughed at everything Dorian said and looked at him with the bright, open admiration of someone who had never once been disappointed by him. Dorian had lit up in her direction the way a fire lights up when someone brings it fresh wood. Seraphina had watched it happen from across the great hall and told herself it was nothing. Flattery. A temporary distraction from a man who had always enjoyed being admired. She had gone back to her administrative chamber and her ledgers and her correspondence and continued holding the kingdom together while the man she loved stopped looking at her. She had given him her forgiveness in advance, without being asked for it, without a single conversation, because that was what she had always done, until last night, until those 7 words through an almost closed door that showed her, with devastating precision, exactly what that habit had cost her. Now she was gone, and Nightbane Keep, still sleeping in the cold pre-dawn dark behind her, had no idea yet what it had just lost. It would learn. These things always teach themselves, the hard way, through absence, through the sudden appearance of all the cracks that had always been there, held shut by hands that were no longer willing to keep holding. Chapter 2. The Road North. The Frostvale Mountains did not care who you had been. That was, Seraphina discovered, something between a comfort and a warning. The mountain passes did not care that she had been Luna of the most powerful territory in 400 miles. The frozen wind coming down through the Thornridge Gap did not soften because she had once negotiated the Ashval Dawnmere peace accords. The narrow paths above the treeline did not widen because her hands were more accustomed to ink and linen bandages than climbing rope. The mountains simply were, and Seraphina simply had to move through them. She had crossed the first 2 days on instinct and residual determination, following the old northern trade road she knew from supply maps she had memorized in her administrative chamber. The mate bond continued its low, persistent ache through every hour. Not the screaming intensity of the first night, but something worse in its consistency. A constant dull pull, like a hand tugging at her collar from behind, gentle and relentless and impossible to ignore. She ignored it anyway. By the 3rd day, the weather changed. The sky went gray-white before noon and the snowfall thickened from delicate to deliberate. And by late afternoon, the path had disappeared beneath 6 inches of fresh accumulation. The temperature dropped with the speed of something malicious, and Seraphina's fingers went numb inside her gloves and her breath came ragged, and the comfortable certainty she had carried out through the eastern gate of Nightbane Keep 3 days ago began, quietly, to crack. She was somewhere in the upper reaches of the Frostvale Pass when her legs simply stopped cooperating. She did not fall dramatically. She sat down in the snow at the side of the path with the deliberate, exhausted movements of someone whose body had been making reasonable requests for 2 days and had finally stopped asking politely. She sat with her pack against a frost-covered boulder and looked out at the white valley below and the gray sky above, and she thought, with great clarity, that she might be in serious trouble. The mate bond pulsed. She closed her eyes. And then, from somewhere above her on the path, from the direction she had been trying to reach, came the sound of boots in snow. More than one set. She straightened instinctively, reaching for the small defensive dagger she kept in her pack, training from years of border raids making her body react before her mind had caught up. Easy. The voice was male. Low. Completely unhurried. We saw you sitting. We're not hunting. She looked up. There were 3 of them, large wolves in human form, dressed in the dark practical leathers of Northern Territory scouts, bearing no insignia she immediately recognized. The one who had spoken was the tallest, with the particular stillness that belongs to men who have long since stopped needing to prove they are dangerous. He had gray eyes. They were studying her with something that was not pity and was not threat. It was something more like assessment, careful, neutral, and entirely absent of assumption. "You came from the South Pass alone in a storm," he said. It was not a question. "Clearly," Seraphina said, which was not the most gracious response she had ever managed. But her fingers were numb and her chest hurt and she was very tired. Something moved at the corner of her vision. She glanced down. Beside the tall wolf's boot, half buried in snow, was a young wolf pup. Barely 6 weeks old by the look of it, its back left leg held at an angle that meant fracture or worse. It was shaking. Its eyes were the clouded amber of an animal in serious pain. The tall wolf noticed her looking. He crouched down in the snow beside the pup without any self-consciousness at all. He pulled off one glove with his teeth and pressed his bare hand against the animal's flank. Not restraining it, just placing warmth there. The pup shuddered and then, slowly, stilled. "Found him in the pass," the tall wolf said quietly. "Storm must have separated him from his mother." Seraphina looked at those hands, large enough to break stone without effort, calloused from weapons and cold, holding warmth against a frightened, injured pup with something close to tenderness. "The leg is fractured above the knee joint," she said, before she had consciously decided to speak. "Not shattered. If it's splinted correctly in the next hour, it will heal clean." The gray eyes came up to hers. "You're a healer, among other things." A pause. Snow fell between them. "My name is Alaric," one of the other scouts said, younger, with a nervous energy that suggested this was not how he usually spent patrol routes. "That's Nikolai. And the one with the wolf is Lucian," the tall one said himself, without looking up from the pup. "Lucian Blackwood." The name landed in Seraphina's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Lucian Blackwood, Alpha of Shadowpine Dominion. A name that moved through the northern territories the way weather moved, preceding itself, felt before seen. She had read diplomatic intelligence on him in the administrative chamber at Nightbane. Ruthless in war, coldly strategic, the kind of leader that other alphas mentioned carefully in certain tones when they thought they were not being overheard. He was kneeling in the snow wrapping a wolf pup's broken leg with strips from his own scarf. "Do you want shelter?" Lucian Blackwood said, without looking up. "Or do you want to disappear?" Seraphina blinked. "Those are not the usual options," she said. "No, but they're the true ones." He tied the last knot on the splint and sat back on his heels, studying his work. "Shadowpine compound is 2 miles northeast. Warm fires and a healer's room you could use. Or I can have my men escort you wherever you're going and we never cross paths again." He stood, the pup cradled against his chest. "Either is acceptable to me." He was not pressing, not persuading. He was simply offering with the complete absence of agenda. Seraphina thought about the path ahead, the remaining mountain miles, the storm that was worsening, the mate bond's dull, persistent pulling. She thought about Dorian's voice through that corridor door, easy and certain. "She'll forgive me. She always does. I want enough silence to hear myself think again," she said. Lucian Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "I can provide." And he turned and walked northeast through the snow, carrying the injured pup with extraordinary gentleness. And his men fell into step around him, and after a moment, Seraphina shouldered her pack and followed. The mate bond pulled backward. She walked forward. Chapter 3, Ashthorn Hollow. Shadowpine Dominion was nothing like Nightbane. That was the first thing Seraphina noticed, and the noticing opened something in her chest that surprised her, because what she felt was not loss. It was relief. Ashthorn Hollow, the settlement at the heart of Shadowpine's territory, was built from cedar and river stone and practical necessity. It had no obsidian walls, no ceremonial gates with guards who watched you pass with the particular evaluating look of people paid to assess your worth before letting you through. The paths between the buildings were packed earth and wood plank, cleared of ice with the workmanlike efficiency of people, who lived very close to real weather and had no patience for pretense. The fires were warm here in the way that working fires are warm, not decorative, not arranged for ambience, but burning hard and high and genuinely useful. People smiled at each other in the street, not the cautious, performative smiles of a court environment, where every expression was a small diplomatic act. These were the unconscious smiles of people who were not afraid. Seraphina stood in the healing house that first morning. A low cedar beam building with dried herb bundles hanging from the rafters and shelves of medicine jars in enthusiastic disorder, and she understood within 4 minutes of looking at it that nobody had organized this space with any real system in approximately 2 years. The instinct rose in her automatically, the way breathing rises. She began reorganizing the shelves, not because anyone asked her to, not because it was her responsibility, but because she was Seraphina Wolfhart and she saw a problem and she was constitutionally incapable of seeing a problem and leaving it unsolved. By afternoon, the shelves were organized by urgency and function. By the following morning she had identified 3 medicines that had been mislabeled, restocked 2 remedies that had run completely out without anyone noticing, and treated a child named Bella who had been brought in with a cough that had been misdiagnosed for 2 weeks and was actually a mild infection responding quickly to the correct tincture. Bella's mother held Seraphina's hands and said thank you with the direct, unadorned sincerity of someone who does not know how to perform gratitude and is simply feeling it. Seraphina had to look away for a moment. She was not accustomed to being thanked. Not like that. Not with that specific plainness. The days that followed settled into a rhythm she had not expected. The healing house in the mornings, the village paths in the afternoons, the quiet cedar cabin Lucian had arranged for her in the evenings. The mate bond's pull had not disappeared, but it had changed its quality. From sharp urgency to a background sadness, something she could breathe around. Something she could set aside for hours at a time while she worked. Working helped. Working had always helped. She treated the river fever cases that had persisted through the autumn. She identified the contamination in the eastern well, mineral runoff from an upstream collapse, and worked with the settlement engineers to dig a new channel. She trained the young healing apprentice, a girl of 15 named Wren, in wound dressing technique that Wren had been taught incorrectly and whose correction would matter enormously the next time a serious injury arrived. And Lucian Blackwood watched, not intrusively, not with the evaluating gaze of someone cataloging her usefulness or deciding how to deploy her capability. He watched the way a person watches something they find genuinely interesting, with attention and the absence of agenda. She noticed him noticing. She said nothing about it. He left hot tea outside the healing house door every morning. Dark pine needle brew, the kind that was warming rather than elegant, and precisely the temperature that suggested someone had timed how long it took her to begin her morning rounds. He repaired the broken window latch in the cabin without mentioning that he had done so. During the settlement council meeting where Seraphina, at Elder Myra's invitation, explained the eastern well contamination and her proposed solution, Lucian sat at the end of the council table and listened to every word without once speaking over her or summarizing what she had already said clearly. When she finished, he said only, "What do you need from us to begin? Not a judgment, not a qualification, not the particular type of praise that contains within it a reminder of who is doing the praising. Just, what do you need?" Seraphina had not been asked that question in a very long time. One afternoon, 3 weeks into her time at Ashthorne, a group of children ambushed her on her way back from the well inspection with an extraordinarily earnest argument about whether snow foxes were smarter than ravens. The debate was passionate and entirely unresolvable and lasted nearly 40 minutes, during which Seraphina found herself laughing. Genuinely, unguardedly, the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere below deliberate thought, at the passionate fury with which a 7-year-old named Cobb defended the intellectual superiority of snow foxes. From across the settlement square, she was not aware that Lucian had stopped walking, was not aware that he was watching, was not aware of the expression on his face. Something quiet and complicated and careful, like a man watching something that matters to him and being very precise about not reaching for it. That evening he sat beside her on the steps of the healing house while the snow came down soft and slow, and they watched the fires in the settlement square burn against the dark. "You reorganized the entire medicine inventory in a day," he said. "It needed it. Ren told me you've been teaching her every evening after rounds. She's quick. She was just taught incorrectly. A pause. How long has it been since someone noticed what you were doing while you were doing it? Lucian asked. The question arrived without any attempt at drama. It was simply a question, asked with the directness of a man who did not find honesty complicated. Seraphina was quiet for a moment. Long enough, she said, that I had stopped noticing the absence. Lucian nodded. He did not push further. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or commentary or the kind of words that would have turned her answer into something about him. He simply sat beside her while the snow fell and let the quiet be enough. And somewhere in Seraphina's chest, beneath the mate bond's fading sadness and the long exhaustion of 6 years of invisible labor, something very small and very dormant began, tentatively, to warm. She was not yet ready to call it hope, but it was alive. She became aware, after a while, that she had stopped watching the fires in the square and had started watching him instead. The stillness he carried, the way he occupied a space without filling it aggressively. Not shrinking, not expanding, simply present. Like a cedar in its own forest. Like something that had long since stopped needing to prove it belonged. He turned and found her looking. He did not smile. He did not look away. He simply held her gaze with those gray eyes, steady and unhurried, the way he did everything. As though there was no version of this moment that required him to perform anything other than exactly what he felt. The fire in the square cracked and shifted. Seraphina looked away first, not because she was embarrassed, but because the thing happening in her chest was too new and too fragile and too important to rush, and she was, above all other things, a woman who understood the difference between what was ready and what was not. I should check on Bella before I sleep, she said. She's been checked. Ren went an hour ago. A pause. I asked her to. Seraphina looked at him again. You asked her. You were watching the children argue about snow foxes for 40 minutes, Lucian said. You needed the evening. She did not have a response for that. Not an immediate one. Because nobody had arranged an evening for her in a very long time. Nobody had noticed she needed one. She stood from the steps slowly, and he stood with her, and they faced each other in the light of the distant fires. Good night, Lucian, she said. Good night, Seraphina. She walked toward her cabin through the quiet settlement, and she did not look back. But she heard him remain on the healing house steps for a long moment before his own footsteps moved away through the snow. And that, his staying just a breath longer, was the thing she carried to sleep with her. Not love. Not yet. But the beginning of the idea that she might, one day, be ready for it. Chapter 4. The Kingdom Without Her. Dorian Grimshade discovered the supply ledger problem on the 14th day. That was how long it took. 14 days before anyone noticed the corrected routing orders had never been filed for the spring caravan system, because Seraphina had been the one maintaining the filing system and she was gone, and nobody else had known the filing system existed. The eastern settlements sent messengers. Then angry messengers. Then an elder named Corvith who arrived at Nightbane's front gate with the particular energy of a man who has made a very long journey specifically to express displeasure in person. Dorian handled the meeting poorly. He was accustomed to walking into rooms where the groundwork had been laid before he arrived, where tensions had been pre-managed, where the right information was already in the right hands, where the emotional temperature had already been calibrated by someone who understood that effective diplomacy happened before the diplomats entered the room. Without Seraphina, he walked into Elder Corvith's meeting cold. It showed. After Corvith left, mollified barely, through a combination of Dorian's status and an emergency supply promise he was not entirely certain Nightbane could honor. Dorian sat in his council chamber and looked at the table around him and noticed, possibly for the first time with real attention, what was not there. The pre-meeting briefing notes that always appeared at his place before council. Gone. The cross-referenced clan correspondence filed in the correct order for quick reference. Gone. The small handwritten reminder cards that had appeared at the margins of his schedule for years, flagging upcoming tensions or settlement concerns he should be aware of. Elder Corvith's settlement has been struggling since the river freeze. Approach carefully. Gone. He had always assumed those notes came from his administrative staff. He now understood they had come from Seraphina. He had never once asked. The weeks that followed were an education in what the word indispensable actually means when you pull the indispensable thing away and watch the structure that depended on it begin to shift and crack. Clan Ashvale and Clan Dawnmere, whose preliminary peace agreement had been Seraphina's work, lost the thread of their negotiations without anyone managing the delicate correspondence between them. The agreement collapsed inside 3 weeks. A border skirmish followed. Wounded warriors from the skirmish arrived at Nightbane's healing hall and found a space that, without Seraphina's supply chain management, was short on 3 critical medicines. The head healer, a competent wolf named Aldous who had relied on Seraphina's supply ordering without fully realizing it, was left improvising in ways that frightened the warriors under his care. Servant after servant left. Not dramatically, not with confrontation. They simply finished their terms and did not renew them. The particular thing that had made Nightbane a place where people wanted to work, a quality nobody had ever named but everyone had felt, was gone, and the absence was felt in small daily ways that accumulated. Talia Ravenmoon filled the visible space where Seraphina had been. She attended the council meetings with the confidence of someone who understood that presence and contribution were not the same thing. She spoke in the meetings with great authority on matters she did not fully understand, which went unchallenged by the council members who found her easier to manage than Seraphina had been, because Seraphina's competence had always been, at some level, slightly uncomfortable. It implied a standard. Talia implied no such thing. Dorian did not see it yet. He was still in the stage where Talia's presence felt like comfort, familiar, easy, uncomplicated. He was still in the stage where Seraphina's absence felt like stubbornness, like a dramatic overreaction that would eventually run its course. She'll come back, he thought, with the certainty of a man who has always been forgiven. She always does. But something was beginning to erode that certainty. He entered Seraphina's old administrative chamber on the 22nd day. He had not been inside it before. He had known she had a working space somewhere in the keep but had not, in 6 years, visited it. It had not seemed necessary to visit. She had always brought him what he needed before he knew he needed it. The chamber was small and organized with the precision of a mind that found chaos intolerable. The shelves held journals, dozens of them, organized by territory and year and subject, filled with Seraphina's neat, clear handwriting. He pulled one at random. Diplomatic notes on the Ashvale clan going back 4 years. Every meeting, every tone, every small observation about which clan elder responded to which kind of approach. Notes that would have made the current border crisis entirely avoidable if anyone had known they existed. He pulled another, weather and supply cross-reference charts, seasons going back to the year they were bonded. She had been tracking supply vulnerabilities against weather predictions for 6 years, quietly, alone, never mentioned. He pulled another, servant welfare notes. Names of workers who were struggling. Names of children of workers who were ill. Notes on which guard rotations were leaving which men too exhausted, with suggested adjustments. All of it in her handwriting. All of it never filed officially, simply done because she had seen the need. Dorian sat down at her small writing desk and looked at the journals surrounding him. He stayed there for a long time. Then he unfolded the note she had left on the stone table in their chambers. He had read it on the first morning and set it aside with the dismissiveness of a man who expected the situation to resolve itself. He read it now differently. You loved my loyalty more than you ever loved me. He sat with those words in the small organized chamber where his Luna had spent 6 years quietly making his kingdom work. And for the first time, the certainty cracked. It was not grief he felt, not yet. It was something more uncomfortable. It was the particular cold of realizing that you have been believing something false for a very long time, and that the falseness was not someone else's lie. It was your own blindness. He sat there as the candles burned low around him, surrounded by her handwriting, by 6 years of her care pressed into paper and ink and careful notation. All of it done in silence, all of it done without him ever once leaning across the table to ask, "What are you carrying? What do you need?" He had never asked. Not because he was cruel. He understood that now, finally, with the uncomfortable clarity that comes too late. He had never asked because it had never occurred to him that she needed anything. She had always simply been there. Ready, capable, settled, and he had mistaken her steadiness for contentment the way people mistake the stillness of deep water for shallowness. She had been deep, and he had never once looked down. He folded the note along its crease with hands that were not entirely steady and set it in the breast pocket of his coat. Close to him, he would keep it there until he understood it fully, and then he would keep it there still, because some truths deserve to stay somewhere you cannot forget them. On the 29th day, he received a report from a merchant traveling the northern routes. The report mentioned that the healing house at Ashthorn Hollow in Shadowpine territory had been transformed in recent weeks, that a woman from the south had arrived and reorganized the entire facility, that she had resolved a well contamination issue that had been threatening the settlement's eastern quarter, that her name was already moving through the northern territories in the particular way that names move when someone has done something genuinely extraordinary. The merchant, who did not know who Dorian was, had said admiringly, "They say she came from nowhere, but she works like someone who has been carrying kingdoms her whole life." Dorian read those words 3 times. Then he set the report very carefully on the desk. He stayed in the administrative chamber for a long time after that, long enough for the candles to burn out completely and leave him sitting in the dark, surrounded by the shape of everything he had failed to see. Meanwhile, down the corridor, Talia Ravenmoon was meeting privately with the Southern Territorial Representative, a wolf named Garen from Clan Veltmere who was, though Dorian did not know this yet, receiving detailed information about Nightbane's internal supply vulnerabilities that he had no legitimate reason to possess. Chapter 5. The Woman They Underestimated. 3 months after Seraphina Wolfhart arrived at Ashthorn Hollow, her name traveled through the Northern Territories without her permission. She had not sought it. She had not performed for it. She had simply done what she had always done, noticed what was needed and worked toward it with the particular intensity of someone who had spent 6 years doing the same work in a place that never looked up to notice. The difference was that Ashthorn Hollow noticed. The river fever outbreak she had managed in the settlement's eastern quarter, contained with meticulous care over 3 weeks when it had been threatening to become something catastrophic, sent grateful families to seek her out from settlements 2 and 3 days' travel away. The supply route she had organized through the northern mountain corridor, a path that the winter storms had made impassable for 2 seasons, and which she had reopened by cross-referencing weather patterns and working with local guides who knew terrain features that the official maps had never captured, brought trade to 4 isolated communities that had been struggling through the cold months. The Northern Territory Council, a body of settlement elders that Seraphina had not known existed 2 months earlier, invited her to present on supply route management at their gathering. She almost declined. Old habit, old training, the instinct that said, "Step back, make space. You are here to support, not to lead." She went anyway. She stood in the council hall at Pinecrest Settlement and spoke clearly for 40 minutes without apology. And when she finished, the elders sat quietly for a moment in the way people do when they have just heard something that reorganized their understanding of a problem they have been carrying for a long time. Lucian Blackwood was at the back of the room. When the applause began, the northern elders expressing approval with the particular restrained energy of people who do not applaud easily, she found his face in the room instinctively. He was not applauding. He was simply watching her with those steady gray eyes, and his expression held something that Seraphina could not immediately name. Later, on the walk back through the cedar forest between Pinecrest and Ashthorn, with the cold stars enormous above the treeline, Lucian fell into step beside her. "They'll be asking for you specifically in every negotiation from here forward," he said. "They're asking for the information. I happen to carry it." "That," Lucian said carefully, "is an interesting distinction to make about yourself." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the women and men who actually change things," he said, "almost always believe the thing they're doing could be done by anyone with access to the same information. Cannot. The information is not the thing." A pause. Cedar branches moved overhead in the wind. "The thing," he continued, "is you. The way you carry it. The way you see what's needed before anyone articulates the need. The way you walk into a room and within 10 minutes you understand what is hurting and what requires care." He was quiet for a moment. "You have always known this about yourself. You were simply somewhere that discouraged you from acknowledging it." Seraphina was silent for a long time. "The world fears you," she said finally, quoting the reputation that had reached her well before she knew the man. Because you know how to fight. Yes, Lucian said. I respected you, she continued, and the verb tense was deliberate, the shift from past to present, and they both noticed it. Because you know how to listen. Lucian stopped walking. She stopped too. The forest was very quiet around them. The cold was sharp and clean and without malice. And Lucian Blackwood looked at Seraphina Wolfhart in the dark beneath the cedars with those gray eyes, and he said, I have been listening to you since the moment my men found you sitting in the snow on the Frostvale Pass. He was not pressing, not moving toward her, not taking. He was simply standing in the dark and being honest, the way he seemed to be honest about everything, without performance, without agenda, without needing her response to be any particular thing. Seraphina felt the mate bond, Dorian's bond, fading now, quieter by the week, pulse once, faint and far away, like an echo. And beside it, in a different part of her chest, something new and tentative and entirely her own pressed quietly forward. She did not reach for it yet, but she stopped pulling away. Meanwhile, in Nightbane Keep, the walls were finishing what Seraphina's departure had started. Talia Ravenmoon had been feeding information to Clan Veltmere for 62 days. The information was specific and detailed. Supply chain vulnerabilities, guard rotation patterns, the current status of Nightbane's territorial alliances, the instabilities inside the council that Seraphina's absence had created and that Talia was actively widening. She had positioned herself not as Dorian's comfort, but as his necessity. She had cultivated his dependence the way Dorian had always cultivated dependence in others, by making herself the center of the information flow, by ensuring that the people around her had less than she did, by being the only source of something essential. She had learned from his example. She had learned poorly, because Seraphina Wolfhart 6 years ago had started a system of archival that Talia Ravenmoon did not know existed. In the administrative chamber, the room Dorian had finally visited, surrounded by her journals, there was a secondary file that Seraphina maintained without ever making it obvious she maintained it. It contained cross-referenced records of every diplomatic communication, every council meeting, every territorial correspondence going back 6 years. Filed by sender and recipient and subject and date, including the communications that had been filed under diplomatic channels but whose content did not match any legitimate diplomatic purpose Seraphina had ever been able to identify. She had not known, when she filed them, exactly what they were. She had flagged them with a small notation. Verify source and intent. She had not had time to investigate before she left Nightbane. But the files were still there. And Dorian Grimshade, who had finally started reading her journals, was getting closer to that shelf. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. Dorian crossed into Shadowpine territory on the first morning of the new moon. He came without an army, without formal announcement, with only 6 wolves in riding leathers, which in the language of Alpha Protocol was something between humility and desperation, and everyone who saw the party arrive at the edges of Ashthorn Hollow read it that way. The news reached Seraphina before he did. She was in the healing house with Ren, reviewing wound care procedures when Alaric Lucian Scout, the nervous energy one who had become something like a protective presence over the past months, appeared at the door with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. The Alpha of Nightbane is at the North Road, he said. Seraphina set down the roll of linen bandage she was holding. She had known this was coming. She had known it in the way you know a winter storm is approaching, not from any specific signal but from the gathering pressure in the air, the particular quality of the days leading up to it. Tell him, she said, that I am finishing rounds. He can wait in the settlement square like anyone else. Alaric blinked. Then he nodded and left. Ren looked at Seraphina with wide eyes. Are you all right? Yes, Seraphina said, and returned to the wound care lesson, and her hands did not shake, and she finished the lesson completely before she walked outside. The settlement square was full of the ordinary life of a working afternoon. Traders moving between stalls, children crossing between errands, a group of warriors returning from a boundary patrol. They parted naturally around the unfamiliar party of 6 wolves standing at the north entrance, and Dorian Grimshade stood among them looking like what he was. A powerful man in a place that had not been organized around making him feel powerful. He looked at Seraphina when she came out of the healing house. She looked back. 6 months ago, even 3 months ago, that look would have cost her something. Even now it was not without weight. He was still the man she had loved. He was still the mate bond's anchor. He was still 6 years of her life, made real and present and standing in the snow of the settlement square. But the woman who had left Nightbane and crossed the Frostvale alone and rebuilt the healing house and spoken to the Northern Council and stood in the cedar forest in the dark beside Lucian Blackwood and let herself begin, only begin, to breathe in the direction of something new. That woman was not the same woman Dorian Grimshade had stood in a corridor and dismissed as inevitable. She walked toward him. From the other side of the square, without hurry, Lucian Blackwood also walked toward the center. He did not intercept. He did not position himself in front of Seraphina or between her and Dorian. He came to stand beside her, precisely beside, exactly level, with the easy naturalness of two people who have gotten used to occupying the same space. Dorian's eyes moved to Lucian and then back to Seraphina. Something crossed his face. Not jealousy exactly, though there was some of that, but something more specific. The particular expression of a man who has just seen, displayed in physical space, the thing he failed to give. Beside. Not behind. Not protected, not managed. Beside. Seraphina. Dorian's voice was lower than she remembered. I need to speak with you. Then speak, she said. A pause. He glanced at Lucian, and at the settlement folk who had slowed and drifted to observe with the unconcealed interest of a community that was devoted to this woman and curious about anyone who arrived looking like trouble. You belong with me, Dorian said. Nightbane needs you. The kingdom is, he stopped. Started again. I understand now what I didn't see. All of it. How much you carried. How much I took, Seraphina said. The word was not unkind. It was simply precise. Dorian absorbed it. Yes, he said. Took. She studied him. Months ago that admission would have broken something in her. Cracked her open with the desperate need to hear exactly those words in exactly that tone. She had spent years waiting for him to see her. Years editing herself down to what fit, what was convenient, what did not challenge the certainty he wore like a second skin. She waited to feel the old pull. What she felt instead was sadness, clean and uncomplicated and final, the way grief feels when it has been properly completed. Dorian, she said, I spent 6 years loving you. 6 years organizing everything so you could walk into rooms already prepared. 6 years sitting beside you and disappearing. She held his gaze. I don't think you meant to use me. I think you simply never looked at me closely enough to see what using looked like. I'm looking now, he said. I know, she said gently. But I spent years trying to become what I needed while standing in Nightbane. I kept making myself smaller so you had more room. She paused. Here, I don't have to be smaller. And I find I'm not willing to go back to it. Dorian was quiet. Besides Seraphina, Lucian said nothing. He stood exactly where he was and let the silence carry what it needed to carry. Finally Dorian looked at Lucian, really looked at him, the alpha assessment, the measuring that was less challenge than question. Lucian met it without ceremony. She is not standing behind me, Lucian said quietly, because she has never needed hiding. It was not an attack. It was not a boast. It was simply the truth of the last 3 months, spoken plainly. Dorian Grimshade closed his eyes. The settlement square went very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that does not happen by accident. It happens when a room or a square or a stretch of cold open air understands that something significant is about to occur and instinctively stops filling itself with sound. The traders at the market stalls had stilled. The children who had been crossing between errands had stopped moving. Even the wind off the Frostvale Mountains seemed to pause, as though the cold itself was waiting. Seraphina felt it before she understood what it was. A shift. Deep inside her chest, beneath the sternum, in the part of a wolf's body where the mate bond lives, that ancient biological involuntary tether that connects two souls at the level below choice. She felt the first tremor of something ending. It was not violent. That surprised her. She had spent months dreading what this might feel like, had imagined it as something sharp and sudden. A cord cut, a door slammed. something that would knock her sideways. It was not that. It was more like the final slow pulling away of roots when a tree has already been uprooted and the last thin threads of earth simply release. Not with force, but with a kind of exhausted completion. A letting go that had already been decided long before the hands finally opened. The bond moved through its ending like a tide going out. First the warmth of it, that constant background warmth she had carried for 6 years, the particular physical awareness of another person that a mate bond creates, the sense of Dorian that had lived in her blood since the night they bonded beneath the winter moon at Nightbane. That warmth began to withdraw. Slowly. Completely. Then the ache. The specific grief-shaped ache of the bond recognizing its own severance. Moved through her chest in one long, rolling wave, and it was real pain, genuine and significant, and she did not pretend otherwise. 6 years. 6 years of real love, real history, real life lived beside someone. That does not end without weight. Her eyes filled. She did not look away. She let herself feel it, all of it, because she had learned, in the months since she left Nightbane, that the only way through grief is through it. Not around, not beneath, straight through with your eyes open. And then, beneath the wave, behind it, on the other side of the pain, arriving the way dawn arrives, not announced, just gradually, undeniably present. Warmth. Not his warmth. Not the mate bond's warmth, with its involuntary pull and its ancient hunger. Something different. Something that came from inside her own chest rather than reaching toward her from outside it. Something that had been waiting very patiently under 6 years of carrying someone else's weight. Space. Her own space. Her own breath. In a chest that was entirely and completely and only hers. She inhaled once. Slowly, deeply. And the air reached parts of her lungs that she had forgotten existed, and her eyes closed for just a moment, and she stood in the center of the Ashthorn settlement square in the winter cold and simply breathed herself back into herself. Dorian dropped to one knee in the snow. It was not theater. It was not a plea. It was simply what happens to the body when the mate bond ends on the side that caused the wound, when 6 years of certainty dissolve in a single moment and the weight of what you have done arrives in full, with no more distance between you and the truth of it. He pressed one fist against the ground and breathed through his teeth. Around the square, no one moved. Lucien stood exactly where he had been standing, beside Seraphina, not in front, not behind, and he was very still, and he did not look at Dorian with triumph because that was not what this moment was. He looked at Seraphina. Only at Seraphina. She opened her eyes. The world was the same winter square. Cedar smoke, cold air, the distant sound of fires, but something in the quality of how she stood inside it had changed completely. She stood as though the ground beneath her feet now belonged to her in a way it had never quite managed to before. She looked down at Dorian Grimshade, kneeling in the snow before her, and what she felt for him in that moment was the most complicated and the most human thing. Not hatred, not satisfaction, not triumph. Something much quieter and much harder. Compassion. Real compassion. The kind that does not require you to go back. "I hope," she said softly, "that you find your way to being a good king, Dorian. Not the kind that depends on someone invisible holding everything together. Actually good. The kind that sees what is happening in its own corridors." He looked up at her. She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she turned and walked away. This time she did not count her breaths. She simply walked. Chapter 7. The life she built. The evidence did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in the form of a junior administrative clerk named Rowan, who had been systematically working through Seraphina's organized journals for 10 days on Dorian's instruction and who had finally, on the 43rd shelf in the administrative chamber, reached the secondary file. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he walked to the council chamber and placed it on the table without a word. The council convened within the hour. The journals were laid open across the long stone table. Pages marked with small strips of parchment that Seraphina had placed months ago, before she even fully understood what she was flagging. Her handwriting ran neat and even across the margins of document after document. Verify source and intent. Verify source and intent. Verify source and intent. 73 pieces of official diplomatic correspondence, routed through legitimate channels, stamped with the appropriate seals. filed in the correct diplomatic registers, and carrying, inside their carefully formal language, a detailed map of Nightbane's vulnerabilities, supply chain gaps, guard rotation schedules, the names of the council members who were most susceptible to pressure, the precise locations of the medicine stores and the weapons cache and the eastern gate that the night guards left unlocked for supply deliveries. Every piece of information that Talia Ravenmoon had needed to give Clan Veltmere a blueprint for taking Nightbane apart from the outside while she dismantled it from the inside. All of it dated to within days of her arrival. The council chamber was absolutely silent. Dorian sat at the head of the table and looked at the spread of journals and did not speak for a long time. He recognized the handwriting. He had been surrounded by it for 10 days in the administrative chamber, learning the full shape of what Seraphina had carried. He knew by now what each notation meant. He knew the particular way she marked something that troubled her, the slight extra pressure on the pen, the double underline beneath the key phrase. She had been troubled by these documents months ago. She had filed the concern carefully, labeled it clearly, and left it behind, not as a weapon, not as an act of revenge, but simply because she was Seraphina Wolfhart and she did not leave problems unaddressed, even problems she did not fully understand yet, even when she was in the middle of her own devastation. She had walked out of Nightbane Keep with a broken heart and a travel pack, and she had still taken the time to flag the evidence. The council representative, Elder Harwick, a silver-haired wolf who had sat at that table for 30 years and was not easily moved, picked up one journal and read the flagged margin note and set it down slowly. She knew, he said, before she left. She flagged all of it. She did not know what it was yet, Dorian said. She wrote verify source and intent. She was careful. She never accused anyone of anything she could not prove. No, Harwick said. She never did anything without being careful. He paused. That is rather the point, isn't it? Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. They called Talia Ravenmoon to the council chamber 20 minutes later. She arrived with the composure of someone who did not yet know the floor had already gone. She saw the journals on the table and her eyes moved across them with the rapid, calculating scan of a person identifying damage. She found more than she expected. Her composure cracked. Not in tears, not in pleading, but in the particular cold stillness of someone who has realized they have been outmaneuvered by a woman they dismissed. She did not go quietly from the chamber, but the council was not in a mood to be moved by noise. Seraphina's notes were specific, cross-referenced, and irrefutable. The kind of documentation that required no interpretation, no argument, no dramatic accusation, only reading. The woman who had built it had understood that the truth does not need a voice if it is organized clearly enough. Talia Ravenmoon was escorted from Nightbane Keep before the day's end. Dorian received the report of her departure from Rowan with the expression of a man who has lived through the consequences of a very long series of avoidable mistakes and is beginning, slowly, to understand the full shape of them. He did not send word north. There was nothing to say. Seraphina had already said everything necessary. Some of it in the note she left on the stone table, some of it in the words she had spoken in the Ashthorn Settlement Square, and some of it, most powerfully of all, in the journals she had left behind in perfect order. She had defeated Talia Ravenmoon without lifting a finger against her, without knowing, when she left, that this was what she was doing. She had simply been thorough. She had simply been herself. And that had been more than enough. Dorian went back to governing his kingdom, this time with real attention and real humility, caring for administrative staff where one woman had once stood. The council disputes were harder to manage. The diplomatic correspondence was clumsier. Things moved more slowly. He made mistakes he would not have made if Seraphina had been in the room. But he learned. He had to. His punishment was not ruin. It was not the dramatic collapse that betrayal sometimes brings in stories like these. It was something quieter and more permanent. Understanding. Full, practical, daily understanding of what he had held and never seen. Regret carried without release for the rest of his days. That was what remaining without her looked like. In Ashthorn Hollow, the healing house had a new wing. Seraphina had designed it herself, working with the settlement's builders over the autumn months. A series of connected rooms that allowed for the care of multiple serious cases simultaneously, with proper ventilation, correct lighting for delicate medical work, and a teaching space at the far end where Ren and two new apprentices learned the craft with the seriousness of students who had been taught by someone who never treated knowledge as something to be hoarded. The Northern Territory Council had formally recognized Ashthorn Hollow as the regional center for healing services. They had done so at Seraphina's proposal, which she had presented without apology and which had been accepted without debate. She had not used Dorian's name, had not traded on her history, had not leveraged anything except the work itself and the reputation the work had built. The distinction mattered to her. She had built this herself. From the ground. From the snow of the Frostvale Pass and the messy shelves of a neglected healing house and the trust of frightened patients and the long late evenings of apprentice instruction and the supply route negotiations and the well contamination resolution and the settlement council presentations. She had built it, and it was hers in the way that things are yours when you have made them without depending on anyone else's permission to begin. Lucian found her in the new wing on a quiet evening in early spring, checking supply inventory with the focused attention she brought to everything, her journal open on the workbench beside her. He set a mug of tea on the bench without announcement. She did not look up immediately. She finished the inventory line she was on, made her notation, and then closed the journal and picked up the mug. "Pine needle," she said, smelling it. "You've been on rounds since before sunrise." The fever cases in the East Quarter needed daily monitoring through the Seraphina, not a command, not a reprimand, just her name, spoken with the particular quality of attention that had been his from the beginning, the way he said her name like it was something he was glad existed. "I know. Ren told me. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to also drink the tea." She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with the ease of a man who has decided where he wants to be and has stopped pretending he might be somewhere else. The firelight from the main room moved across his face and the gray eyes held the warmth she had been watching accumulate there over months. Slowly, like spring thaw, which moves without announcement and cannot be hurried and cannot be stopped once it has truly begun. "You could lead this entire Northern Territory," he said, "not with ambition, not with pressure, with the simple conviction of someone stating what they have observed. The elders are already asking. The council looks to you in every session." "I know," she said. "I'm not telling you to. I'm saying whatever you want, the structure is there for it." He paused. "I'd like to be part of what you're building. However that looks to you." He was not asking her to belong to him. He was not proposing a future where she stepped sideways into his life and shaped herself to its edges. He was simply, and she understood this precisely the way she understood most things, asking whether she would stay. Asking whether there was room for him inside the life she was actively, daily, choosing. Choice, not ownership, not certainty taken without asking. A question, extended toward her with open hands. Seraphina set down the tea and looked at Lucian Blackwood in the doorway of the healing house she had built, in the settlement that had seen her clearly, in the Northern Territory that had not required her to become smaller to belong. And she thought about the corridor in Nightbane Keep and the silver tray that had not fallen and the voice through a half-open door and the moment she had turned around. She had turned around and started walking. And this was where walking had brought her. "Stay for dinner," she said. Ren made the pine broth. It was not a declaration. It was not the kind of grand romantic gesture that announces itself with ceremony and expects applause. It was something better. It was an ordinary evening. Warm fires. Snow on the cedar roof. A woman who had walked through 6 years of being invisible and 1 brutal winter of rebuilding herself from the foundations up, saying to a man who had never asked her to be less than she was, "Yes, there is room." She would not call it love yet, but it was alive and it was growing, and it was entirely, completely hers. Lucian Blackwood moved away from the doorframe and came inside. The door closed quietly behind him. Outside, the spring snow was already beginning to thin. In another month, the first frost flowers would push through the earth along the riverbank paths, small and silver white and stubbornly alive, blooming through the last cold because they had waited through the dark season without forgetting what they were. There is a kind of woman who does not return after betrayal, not because she cannot, but because she has built something too true, and too hard won, and too completely her own to leave behind. Seraphina Wolfhart had walked out of a kingdom that depended on her without knowing her. She had crossed a mountain range alone in winter. She had built a healing house, and a supply network, and a reputation, and a life. All from the small, persistent certainty that she was worth more than being someone's given. And she was right. Some women do not return after betrayal. They build lives too beautiful to abandon. And if the story moved you even a little, if it made you feel seen, or thought about someone you know, or simply reminded you that quiet strength is still strength, please share it with one person who needs to hear it today. That is how these stories find the people they are meant to find. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories coming, stories about women who chose themselves, men who learned too late, and love that does not ask you to become less. They are worth your time, and so are you. Now I want to hear from you. Down in the comments, which moment in the story hit you the hardest? Was it the corridor when the tray stayed perfectly still? Was it the note she left behind? Or was it the moment Lucian said she did not need hiding? Tell me. I genuinely read every single comment. Until the next story, take care of yourself.